Chapter 1 of the Spanish Conquerors. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Spanish Conquerors by Irving Berdine Richman. Chapter 1, West and East. Wherefore we may judge that those persons who connect the region in the neighborhood of the Pillars of Hercules, Spain, with that towards India, and who assert that in this way the sea is one, do not assert things very improbable. Aristotle, De Silo, 2:14. The Spaniard of the 15th century is recognizable by well-defined traits. He was primitive, he was proud, he was devout, and he was romantic. His primitiveness we detect in his relish for blood and suffering, his pride in his austerity and exclusiveness, his devoutness in his mystical exaltation of the Church, and his romanticism in his passion for adventure. After printing had spread in Spain, the romanticism of the Spaniard, to confine our observations for the present to that trait, was fostered by a wealth of books. Amadis of Gaul, Palmerin of England, the exploits of Esplandian, Don Belanis, all these works were filled with heroes, queens, monsters, and enchantments, and all, it is needless to remark, held an honored place upon the shelves of Miguel de Cervantes, that Spanish romanticist par excellence, the author of Don Quixote. But prior to 1500, or down to 1492, let us say, the romanticism of the Spaniard, like that of other Europeans, was ministered to not so much by books as by tales passed from mouth to mouth, tales originating with seamen and reflected in the names on mariners' charts, and tales by landsmen recorded in the relations, reports, and letters of missionaries, royal envoys, and itinerant merchants. To the west of Spain stretched the Atlantic Ocean, and in the Atlantic the lands most remote were the Canaries, the Madeiras, the Cape Verde group, and the Azores. What was beyond the Canaries, the Madeiras, the Cape Verde group, and the Azores? To this the answer was naught so far as known, save the Atlantic itself, the Mare Tenebrosum, or Sea of Darkness, a sea so called for the very reason that within it lies hid whatever land there may be beyond these islands. West of Ireland, but east of the longitude of the Azores, seamen said was to be found the island of Brazil, west of the Canaries, and also west of the longitude of the Azores, the great island of Antilia, and southwest of the Cape Verde group, at an indeterminate distance, the island of Saint Brandon. Concerning Brazil, except that the name signified red or orange-colored dyewood, particulars were lacking. But Antilia, the island over against the island opposite, had been the refuge, had it not, of the Iberian Goths after their defeat by the Moors, and here 2 archbishops of Oporto, with 5 bishops, had founded 7 cities. St. Brandon, too, was the subject of somewhat specific affirmation, for in quest of this island had not St. Brandon, abbot of Ilek, in the 6th century, put fearlessly to sea with a band of monks? Nor were the islands mentioned all of those for which seamen vouched. There were besides Isla de Mam, Man Island; Salvaggio, Savage Island; alias Le Mans de Sant'Anaxio, Hand of Satan; Insula in Mar, Island of the Sea; Rayella, King Island; and various others. Some of these islands, it was surmised, must be the abode of life, if not life of the type of the Hydras and Gorgons of antiquity, at least of a type of extra mundane and weird, of Amazons, of men with tails, of anthropophagi, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders, of crouching Calibans, of mermaids, and of singing Ariels. And amid uncertainties respecting Antilia and her Protean sisterhood, one certainty stood out. In considerable numbers these islands had figured boldly on marine charts of accepted authority, from the famed Catalan of 1375 to the Beccaria of 1435 and the Benincasas of 1463, 1476, and 1482. Noteworthy as were the yarns spun by seamen in the 15th century, tales circulated by landsmen, by missionaries, royal envoys, and merchants were more noteworthy still. But these missionaries and other landsmen, whither did they fare? In what quarter did they adventure? Not in the west, for that was the seaman's realm, but in the east these travelers had their domain. The chief potentate in all Asia, so Europe believed, was Prester John, a Christian and a rich man. To find him, or some equivalent of him, and bring him into helpful relationship with Christian but distracted Europe became the ambition of popes and secular rulers alike. Hence the missionaries. Hence Friar John of Pian de Carpine and Friar William of Rubruck, who from 1245 to 1253 penetrated Central Asia to Karakorum. Hence, furthermore, John of Monte Corvino, Ordoric of Pordenone, and John of Marignoli, who, as friars and papal legates from 1275 to 1353, visited Persia, India, the Malay archipelago, China, and even Tibet. The tales these landsmen brought were good to hear, pretty to hear tell, as Friar Odoric puts it. First there was Cathay, Cathay of the Mongol plains, with its khans or emperors housed in tents, twanging guitars and disdainful of all mankind; Cathay of the ocean sea, with ports thronged with ships and wharves glutted with costly wares; Cathay of the city of Kinsay, stretched like paradise through the breadth of heaven, with lake, canals, bridges, pleasure barges, baths, and lights o' love; Cathay of imperial Cambaluc, with its palace of the Great Khan, its multitude of crowned barons in silken robes, its magic golden flagons, its troops of splendid white mares, its astrologers, leeches, conjurers, and choruses of girls, with cheeks as full as the moon, who by their sweet singing pleased Friar Odoric, ah, friar, most of all. Then there was India, including Cipangu, or Japan, with its rose-colored pearls, and gold abundant beyond all measure; India of the 2400 islands and 64 crowned kings; India of the ruby, the sapphire, and the diamond; of the Moluccas, drowsy with perfumes and rich in drugs and spices; of the golden temples and the uncouth gods; of the eunuchs and the ivory, the beasts, the serpents, and the brilliant birds. Other tales there were brought by these landsmen, the missionaries. Just as the West had its sea of darkness, the Atlantic Ocean, so the East had its land of darkness, the extreme northeast of Asia, a region of mountain and sand, of cold and snow, where dwelt the Gog and Magog of Ezekiel. And to reach this dark land, barriers must be overcome, defiles fierce with demoniac winds, deserts swathed in mystic light and vibrant to jigging tunes, valleys awful with dead men's bones. Moreover, as in the West the mythical islands of the dark sea were the abode of creatures beyond the thought of man, so in the East the dark land harbored beings quite as preternatural. Here co-tenants, so to speak, of Gog and Magog were the cynocephali, or dog-headed creatures, the parasitai, so narrow-mouthed as to be forced to subsist exclusively on odors; jointless hopping creatures who cried chin chin; one-eyed creatures, midget creatures, and what not. "I was told," says Friar Rubric, "that there is a province beyond Cathay, and at whatever age a man enters it, that age he keeps which he had on entering; which," naively exclaims the friar, "I do not believe." Odoric had far more hardihood in narrative, for, speaking of India, he notes, "I heard tell that there be trees which bear men and women like fruit upon them. These people are fixed in the tree up to the navel, and there they be. When the wind blows, they be fresh, but when it does not blow, they are all dried up. This I saw, not in sooth, but I heard it told by people who had seen it." As a sceptic among tale bringers from the East, however, John of Marignolle ranks foremost. A paradise on earth still somewhere existing, an Adam's footprint in Ceylon, a Noah's ark still on Ararat, such things were verities to him, but not so preternatural creatures. The truth is, he declares, that no such people do exist as nations, though there may be an individual monster here and there. Indeed, so adventurous in scepticism is John, that in some particulars he o'erleaps himself. There are, he avers, no antipodes, men having the soles of their feet opposite to ours, certainly not. He has learned, too, by sure experience, that if the ocean be divided by two lines forming a cross, two of the quadrants so resulting are navigable, and the two others not navigable at all, for God willed not that men should be able to sail round the whole world. So far as missionaries were concerned, the East might lure them to Cathay, or even to farthest India, through interest in some shadowy Prester John, an interest largely of a religious nature; but it was otherwise with royal envoys and merchants. The lure of the East for them was treasure and merchandise, in other words, wealth. As early as 1165 67, a Spanish Jew of Navarre, Rabbi Benjamin by name, who was concerned in trade, set forth from Tudela, his native city, and visiting Saragossa, Genoa, Constantinople, Tyre, Damascus, Bagdad, and points in Arabia, reached the island of Kish and the mouth of the Persian Gulf, at the gates of India, and within earshot of Cathay. He was the first modern European, it is said, to as much as mention China. Nearly a century later, 1254, appeared the royal traveller Haytham I, king of Lesser Armenia, on a visit to Mangu Khan at Karakorum. Then in 1275 came Marco Polo, son and nephew of traders bred in the commercial traditions of Venice, and himself the first European of parts to tell of the splendors of the great Khan. Polo's most interesting successor, 1325 55, was an Arab man of the world, gay, selfish, sensuous, and observing, Ibn Batuta. Batuta journeyed deviously from Morocco to Cathay and India. Thence he leisurely returned to his native Tangier by way of Spain, and as he strolled he sang, "Of all the four quarters of heaven the best, I'll prove it past question, is surely the West." To these landsmen, the envoys and merchants, the lure of the East was wealth. It was silks, silks of Gelant, taffetas of Shiraz, yeds and serpes, sendals of Gren and Brown, cloth of gold, gold brocades, silver gauze, silks and satins of Suzhou, cramoisie, fabrics wrought in beasts, birds, trees, and flowers. It was also gold, ingots of gold, beaten gold, gold and silver plate, gold pillars and lamps, gold coronets and headdresses, gold armlets and anklets, gold girdles, cinctures, censers, cups, and basins. Pearls, too, of beautiful water, and gems, especially of India, made part of this wealth. Said Ibn Batuta, "Men at Kish descend to the bed of the sea (the Persian Gulf) by ropes and collect shellfish, then split them and extract the pearls." Again he said, "I traversed the bazaar of the jewelers at Tabrets, and my eyes were dazzled by the variety of precious stones which I beheld. Handsome slaves, superbly dressed and girdled with silk, offered their gems for sale to the Tartar ladies, who bought great numbers. But of all this wealth, so luring in the fact, so alluring in the recital, the chief items were aromatics and spices, sandalwood, aloewood, spikenard, frankincense, civet, and musk, rhubarb, nutmegs, mace, cloves, ginger, pepper, and cinnamon. And of spices one stood preeminent, pepper. Rabbi Benjamin was of his time when he said that 2 parasangs from the Sea of Sodom is the pillar of salt into which Lot's wife was turned. But he was for subsequent times as well, when he described the pearls and pepper. To the heat of Pepperland, Malabar, a Persian ambassador to India, once bore witness in the statement that so intense was this heat that it burned the ruby in the mine and the marrow in the bones, to say naught of melting the sword in the scabbard like wax. But this by the way. Pepper it was, the spice which in ancient days had formed part of the ransom of Rome from Alaric, that throughout the Middle Ages and far into the 15th century constituted in Europe the commodity most prized and talked of, for it was the one most costly, the one closest to gold in intrinsic worth. Prior to 1492, then, the romanticism of the Spaniard, as of other Europeans, was stirred by tales of the West and tales of the East, tales by seamen and tales by landsmen, and these in the main were circulated by word of mouth. Furthermore, so potent were these stories that even when ascribed to mere weavers of dreams, they would not be denied and could not be ignored. And in the minds of 2 or 3 persons they begat the old question of Aristotle: might not the ocean sea, which bordered Cathay and held Cipangu, be one with the Sea of Darkness, which lay west of Europe and held Antillia? End of chapter 1. Chapter 2, Part 1 of The Spanish Conquerors by Irving Berdine Richman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Columbus and New Lands. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars. It may be we shall touch the happy isles. Tennyson, Ulysses. Among the sojourners in Spain prior to 1492 there was a Genoese by name Christopher Columbus. He was tall and well built, of dignified mien, with red hair and beard, a long ruddy face, clear grey eyes, and aquiline nose. To inferiors his manner was exacting and brusque, to equals it was urbane, and to superiors it was courtly. His figure showed to advantage, whereof he was not unduly aware, and he evinced a taste for yellow in beads, and for crimson and scarlet in caps, cloaks, and shoes. Unlike the Spaniards whom he was to lead, Columbus was not in disposition primitive. He had no relish for blood and suffering. He was, however, proud, with a measure of austerity, and he was highly romantic and strikingly devout. His most signal powers, and they were signal indeed, were moral powers. In patience, endurance, tenacity, energy, will, powers which, far more than those distinctively intellectual, make for greatness, the world has rarely known his equal. Imagination, too, he possessed, rich and ardent, and it rendered him poetic, eloquent, and persuasive. But just as he possessed the qualities named, so likewise he possessed the defects of them. He was masterful and imaginative, but his masterfulness tended to ungenerousness, and his imagination to vagary and mischievous exaggeration. Nor was this all. His moral powers were largely determined in exercise by two positive principles of action which were undeniably sinister: vanity and cupidity; and under stress of these he became at times dissimulating, boastful, and crafty. It is probable, however, that the sinister in him has by recent writers been somewhat over magnified. Throughout everything he was sincerely and enthusiastically religious. To him, as to others of Machiavellian strain, the end justified many means, but not all, though among the justified means were those of guile. According to the findings of the most recent scholarship, Christopher Columbus, the eldest in a family of 4 sons and 1 daughter, was born at Genoa on a date between August 26 and October 31, 1451. His grandfather probably, and his father certainly, was a wool dealer and weaver, and the latter at one time also conducted a wine shop. None of his progenitors had place or rank, and his sister married a cheesemonger. There were other persons in Europe in his time of the sobriquet Columbus, one of whom, William of Caseneuve, was a corsair and vice admiral of France under Louis XI. And with these Christopher Columbus, about 1501, sought to indicate relationship by the remark that he was not the first admiral in his family; but the claim, so far as can be ascertained, was wanting in foundation. The education of Christopher was of the most elementary sort. It consisted merely of what was provided by a school maintained by the Weavers' Guild of the town of his birth, in a little street called Pavia Lane. How meagre his first advantages were appears in the fact that at no time in life did he assume to write his mother tongue, Italian, not even when addressing the Bank of St. George in Genoa. We have seen that as a man Columbus was both vigorous of body and imaginative of mind. For him, therefore, as a lad in Genoa, the Genoa of our travellers Rabbi Benjamin, Marco Polo, and Ibn Battuta, to develop a taste for the sea was more natural than not. In fact, he tells us that from his 14th year he was accustomed to embark on ships. But in 1472, when he was 21 years old, he declared before a notary that he was by trade a weaver. We may suppose, then, that up to this period his seafaring was tentative, or in the nature of a youth's adventures. Thereafter it became more and more an occupation. In Genoa at this time dwelt 2 noblemen with whom Columbus seems to have been on terms of friendship. He went with them in 1475 to the island of Chios in the Aegean, where he obtained a shipment of Malmsey wine, and became familiar with mastic. In 1476 the 2 noblemen embarked on a voyage to England, and again Columbus accompanied them in a flotilla, for it was a voyage of importance, which consisted of 5 armed merchantmen. When they were off Cape St. Vincent, who should appear but the corsair and French vice admiral, William of Caseneuve, alias Columbus. Between the Genoese vessels and those of Louis XI there straightway ensued a desperate struggle. In the end, ships on both sides took fire, and the crews leaped overboard. Columbus of Genoa, the future discoverer, leaped with others, and being fortunate enough to be picked up, was landed on the Portuguese coast near Lisbon, wounded, drenched, and exhausted. Such, in August 1476, was the advent of Columbus in Portugal, an advent certainly fortuitous, if not miraculous, as he terms it. From Lisbon, Columbus continued in December his interrupted voyage to England, stopping probably at Bristol, and it would seem that he even adventured into the seas toward Iceland. "I sailed," he says, as quoted by his son Ferdinand, "in the month of February, 1477, 100 leagues beyond the island of Thule, Iceland. At some period prior to 1503 the discoverer had read the Latin poet Seneca and found the lines: "In later ages a time shall come when the ocean shall relax its chains, when Typhus shall disclose new lands, and Thule shall no longer be earth's bound." Now Columbus took Typhus the pilot as his own prototype, and to make the identification more complete he may have deemed it well that the discoverer of America should, as a preliminary, have fared beyond Thule. In the career of Columbus, Portugal was the first turning point. Hither he returned in 1477 or 1478, and here in 1479 or 1480, after a trip back to Genoa, he married. This event was the reward of his piety. In Lisbon there was a convent of the religious order of St. Jacques, called the Convent of Saints. Its protégés were bound to vows of chastity, conjugal chastity, not celibacy; and among them was Philippa, a daughter of two of the noblest of Portuguese houses, and Philippa was beautiful. Coming daily to the chapel of this convent to make his devotions, Columbus saw Philippa, fell in love with her, and they were wed. To the couple, in 1480 or 1481, a child was born, Columbus's first son, Diego. At this period, too, Columbus became associated in Lisbon with his younger brother, Bartholomew, a prepossessing youth of about 19, astute, of some education, and skilled in the art of limning marine charts. The father of Philippa Columbus was Bartholomew Perestrello, governor of Porto Santo of the Madeira group, and it is a firm tradition that at his death in 1457 he left to his wife Isabel, Philippa's mother, charts and papers which served first to direct Columbus's mind toward great projects in the West. Another tradition, long credited, then long discredited, and now revived, was that Columbus, upon his marriage, settled in the island of Madeira, which is near to that of Porto Santo, and that while he was here, a Spanish ship, which had been driven westward to the island, afterwards found by Columbus and named Espanola, came forlornly back, getting as far only as Madeira. Here, so the tradition ran, the pilot of the ship, together with such of the crew as survived, debarked; but the crew, famished and sick, all died, leaving only the pilot. Then he too died in the house of Columbus, but not before he had imparted to his host the amazing story of his voyage, and had given to him his log and a chart of his route. Be the truth of these two traditions what it may, it is a well settled fact that in Portugal Columbus met pilots and captains, and was enabled to accompany Portuguese expeditions down the coast of Africa. "I was," he says, "at the fortress of St. George of the Mine, belonging to the King of Portugal, which lies below the equinoctial line." The object of such voyages was largely the discovery of new islands. The Canaries and the Madeiras, the outermost of the Azores, and the Cape Verde group, all were treasure trove of the 15th century, and there might well be others. In these times, indeed, islands rose smiling to greet the discoverer on his approach. Nay, more, where actual islands were not forthcoming, imaginary ones developed in their stead. But were these isles as mythical and imaginary as they were represented? The question is pertinent, for upon the answer depends in good measure what we shall think of the nature of the incentive which underlay the voyage of 1492, the voyage resulting in the discovery of America. The very appearance of islands like Antilia, Salvaggio, Rayella, and Insula in Mar on charts, such for example as the Beccaria of 1435, attests the prevalence of a tradition, and that a mature one, that such a group existed. Such a tradition could probably have had but one origin: chance voyages across the Atlantic from Europe to North America, and especially to the West India Islands of North America. Indeed, in 1474 or 1475, Fernão Tellis sought the mythical Antillia, sometimes called the Isle of the Seven Cities, under express warrant from the King of Portugal, Alfonso V. And in his journal of 1492, Columbus records that many honourable Spanish gentlemen of the Canary group declared that every year they saw land to the west of the Canaries. Again, he records that in 1484, when he was in Portugal, a man Domingues do Arco came to the king, John II., from the island of Madeira, to beg for a caravel to go to this island that was seen; and that the same thing, the existence of an island in the west, was affirmed in the Azores. How, therefore, there might arise a story, true or false, of a shipwrecked pilot who gave to Columbus the clue to the finding of the island of Hispaniola, may readily be perceived. But concerning stories of and by pilots, more anon. Columbus had now acquired some knowledge of the theory and art of navigation, and incidentally some knowledge of Latin; and having made up his mind, and as had Telliez before him, that in the Atlantic to the west there yet remained islands and lands to be discovered, he obtained an audience with the King of Portugal, and laid before him a definite proposal. He asked for 3 caravels, equipped and supplied for a year, and in the event of lands being found, for the viceroyalty and perpetual government therein, a tenth of the income therefrom, the rank of nobleman, and the title of Grand Admiral. According to Portuguese chroniclers writing in the 16th century, the particular land Columbus had in view was Simpangu, or Japan. But whatever Columbus may have disclosed or reserved with respect to Japan, or with respect to Antillia, at this first interview with the Portuguese king, so affronted was the monarch by what he felt to be the vanity and presumption of the petitioner, that he promptly referred his plea to a council of 3 experts, by whom, after some deliberation, it was dismissed. Thereupon Columbus, late in 1485 or early in 1486, left Portugal for Spain. At this point in the fortunes of Christopher Columbus there arises for consideration a peculiar circumstance. Columbus had a double, the well-known cosmographer of Nuremberg, Martin Behaim. Like Columbus, this man was born near the middle of the 15th century. Like him, he lacked university training. Like him, his early activities were commercial. Like him, he settled in Portugal, 1480 84. Like him, he voyaged to Africa. Like him, he was identified with an Atlantic island, Fayal in his case, and married the daughter of the governor. Like him, he was busied with nautical studies in Lisbon. Like him, he was not highly regardful of veracity. And finally, like him, he died in neglect early in the 16th century. Behaim, however, unlike Columbus, was of patrician ancestry, was instructed in the use of nautical instruments, became a knight of Portugal, and at Lisbon had the entrée to aristocratic and scientific circles. The extent of his geographical knowledge may be inferred from a globe which he completed at Nuremberg in 1492, before the return of Columbus from his first voyage. His authorities included Aristotle and Strabo, Ptolemy, Marcus Polo, and Sir John Mandeville, but his chief authority was Pierre d'Ailly, whose Imago Mundi (World Survey), written in 1410, formed a compendium of the geographical and cosmographical notions of authors such as Marinus of Tyre and Afriganus the Arabian. To put the matter briefly, the ideas of Pierre d'Ailly and Marco Polo are strikingly expressed in this globe, which shows Cathay and India both marked rich opposite to Portugal and Africa, and about 120 degrees west of the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores, instead of the actual distance of over 200 degrees. Cathay is thus brought forward nearly to the position of California. Cipangu, or Japan, marked as especially rich, falls athwart the position of Mexico, while Antillia lies northeast of the position of Hayti or Hispaniola, and St. Brandon occupies in part the position of northern South America. But why did Baha'im take pains to construct a globe? The answer is clear. He had recently, 1486, adventured in a project to confirm his geographical ideas. He had attempted a secret voyage westward to Asia in partnership with two fellow islanders, Fernandulmo of Terceira, a navigator, and João Alfonso Estreito of Madeira, his patron. The enterprise had failed, and yet he did not wish his ideas to be lost or appropriated by another. Concerning Columbus, however, the important question is, was he indebted to Baha'im for his own ideas of cosmography, for the idea especially of a small earth? It would hardly seem so. The two men may have met in Portugal, but even if they had, each at the time was guarding a secret, or the approaches to one, Columbus that of islands, perchance of a specific island to be discovered, and Baha'im that of a scheme for exploiting Asia. That not very much confidential communication between them was likely under the circumstances may be conjectured. Columbus, according to his own statement, entered Spain after 14 years spent in vain labors in Portugal. As a matter of fact, his stay there did not at the utmost exceed 10 years, probably only 5 or 6. He came accompanied by his son Diego, for Philippa, beautiful daughter of the convent of saints, had probably died soon after Diego's birth. Furthermore, he quitted Portugal, for what reason may never be known, secretly at night. In Spain, Columbus's first objective was Palos. Here, at the monastery of La Rabida, whose guardian, Antonio de Marchena, the future discoverer, is said to have known in Portugal, he found lodgings for himself and a temporary home for his son. The supposition is that at Palos, which as a seaport was the resort of mariners, and where there were many Portuguese, Columbus counted upon obtaining special information with regard to the landfall of some particular early voyage or voyages into the West. But if Palos was Columbus's first objective in Spain, his second was the court of the Spanish sovereigns Ferdinand and Isabella. To these personages Columbus worked his way, so to speak, by the influence of the Duke of Medina Coeli, who had wealth, and who at first contemplated assuming in the schemes of Columbus a rôle not unlike that of Estreito in the project of Baha'im, but coming to realize that the affair was one to be accomplished successfully only under royal patronage, the Duke applied to the sovereigns, who commanded that Columbus himself be sent to court. Cordova now for some time had been the seat of government, and here Columbus arrived on January 20, 1486. The sovereigns were then absent, but returned at the end of April or 1st of May, and the coveted audience took place. What occurred is not known. Presumably Ferdinand and Isabella, after a courteous hearing, smilingly put by the question of exploration, for they referred it to the queen's confessor, Hernando de Talavera, an ecclesiastic by no means ungenerous or bigoted, with instructions to summon a council for its consideration. As for the council, not a soul who was a member ever revealed aught of its composition or doings, save Dr. Rodrigo de Maldonado, who says that men of science and mariners were in attendance, no less than literary men and theologues, and that Columbus himself was subjected to interrogation. Talavera's council conferred at intervals for 5 years, often at Salamanca, and at length, late in 1490, reported adversely for Columbus, and the sovereigns accepted the report. In the life of the great Italian adventurer, our future discoverer and admiral, these 5 years are among the most interesting and significant. They mark, it is true, a moral and material decline, but like the first years in Portugal, they mark an intellectual advance. While awaiting action by the council, Columbus was retained at court and encouraged by occasional donations of money, donations appearing on record as made to a stranger occupied with certain affairs relative to the service of their highnesses. The sums in all came to $510, 170,000 maravedis, but small as they were, they had altogether ceased by 1488. In that year it was, or at the end of 1487, the preceding year, that Columbus for a second time fell victim to feminine attractions. The maiden, like his first bride, Philippa, was young, 18 or 20 years old, possessed a beautiful name, Beatrix Enriquez, and doubtless a beautiful person, but unlike Philippa, she was humble of birth and very poor. So lowly, indeed, was she that Columbus did not stoop to take her in marriage, but formed with her a liaison, the result of which was the birth, about August 15, 1488, of his second son and future biographer, Ferdinand. Between the date just given and the spring of 1489, Columbus would seem to have gone back to Portugal under a safe conduct from John II, but why he went, if he did go, is unknown, and by May 12, 1489, he was again in Spain and in attendance upon Ferdinand and Isabella at the siege of Baza. Thenceforth, however, until the final rejection of his project by the sovereigns in 1490, he drops from view, excepting as we are accorded glimpses of him gaining bread for himself and Beatrix in Cordova by limning marine charts, wherein he evidently had been instructed by his brother Bartholomew, and by selling printed books. The vending of printed books may have meant much in that intellectual advance which has been spoken of as characterizing for the discoverer to be the days, sombre or hectic, through which he was now passing. Some years before his brother had fallen on hard times, Bartholomew Columbus had betaken himself from Portugal, where he had witnessed the return of the great Portuguese captain Bartholomew Diaz from his discovery of the Cape of Good Hope, to enlist the aid of King Henry VII of England in his brother Christopher's project. Then, abandoning England, he had recourse in turn to France, and now was making himself agreeable at the court of Charles VIII. Thither Columbus determined to follow him, but his departure was prevented by a visit which he paid to Palos, to the monastery of La Rabida, to make further arrangements for the care of his son Diego. This visit, unlike the first, does not seem to have been inspired by a specific wish for light upon voyages with strange landfalls under strange pilots. Columbus was poverty-stricken and for once discouraged. With what cheer he might, he met his friend, the former guardian, Antonio de Marchena, and also, perhaps for the first time, the officiating guardian, Juan Perez, once confessor to Queen Isabella. By these three, under the stimulating zeal of the monks, a plan was contrived. Columbus should thoroughly canvass the maritime section, having Palos for a centre for all possible information regarding pioneer voyages into the Sea of Darkness. The first seaman to be sought out and catechized was Pedro de Velasco, a pilot of Palos itself. Next, after Velasco, an unnamed pilot of the port of Santa Maria near Cadiz was visited. He had sailed west from Ireland, and had, he thought, sighted the coasts of Tartary, not improbably Labrador. Finally, a second pilot, domiciled in Palos, Pedro Vasquez de la Frontera was waited upon, and what was gathered from him was suggestive indeed. Between 1460 and 1475 he had made a voyage into the west with a prince of Portugal to discover new lands. Their purpose was to sail straight west, but encountering that vast field of marine herbage known as the Sargasso Sea, he had turned back. At this time in Palos, the most important man of maritime affairs was the head of the family of Pinzon, Martin Alonso, best known and bravest of captains and pilots, and to him Columbus would first have addressed himself, had not this mariner been absent with a cargo of sardines at Rome. As it was, Columbus awaited his return eagerly. Pinzon, as it chanced, was at this juncture cherishing a project of his own for exploring to the west, and while in Rome had sought light at the library of Pope Innocent VIII upon lands in the ocean sea. There he had seen a map and a book, both of which, in the form of copies, no doubt, he had brought with him. These documents, according to Pinzon's son, Pinzon the father not only submitted to Columbus, but gave into his hands. Furthermore, Pinzon and Columbus now went together to the house of Pedro Vasquez de la Frontera, and got him to repeat the tale of how, with a prince of Portugal, he had sailed west as far as the Sargasso Sea, from before which he had recoiled. It was necessary to brave this obstacle, said Vasquez, because by not doing so the prince had failed to find land. If, on meeting the Sargasso Sea, one would but keep straight on, it would be impossible that land should not be found. How, on his voyage in 1492, Columbus made use of a chart whereon he himself had depicted certain islands, how this chart was passed back and forth between him and Martin Alonso Pinzon, and how, apropos of the impending landfall, one of the pilots spoke to Columbus of indications from your book, are incidents well known. Nor is it less well known that on this voyage, after encountering the Sargasso Sea, Columbus, despite protest, braved the obstacle and kept straight on, literally on and on, following as nearly as he could the 28th parallel, till land rewarded his perseverance. Not long after the return of Martin Alonso Pinzon from Rome, Guardian Juan Perez, and perhaps Pinzon, also wrote to Queen Isabella, asking a further hearing for Columbus and his project. The request was granted, and Perez was summoned to court at Santa Fe before Granada. He set out in a manner truly Columbian, alone, on a mule, secretly, at low midnight. He was soon empowered to invite Columbus to join him. In December the latter came. Ferdinand and Isabella were in receptive mood. Granada was about to fall, and Spain to be delivered from the Moor forever. A council was ordered, one like Talavere's, composed of philosophers, astrologers, cosmographers, seamen, and pilots. With Talavere's council, however, the primary consideration had been the theoretical feasibility of Columbus's project. With the new council, it was the practical question of ways and means that gave pause. Columbus, repeating with emphasis the terms submitted to King John II of Portugal, demanded of Ferdinand and Isabella a patent of nobility, the admiralty of the ocean, the viceroyalty and government of all lands discovered, and a commission of 10% upon everything within the limits of his admiralty, which might be bought, exchanged, found, or gained. That, in addition, he should demand 3 caravels, to cost possibly 2,000,000 maravedis, $6,000, was by comparison trifling. In after years the discoverer of America was wont to complain that in his struggle for recognition in Spain everybody had derided him, save 2 monks, Marchena and Perez. Derided he no doubt was, but the cause, perhaps, was not so much his belief in problematical islands and lands as his demand for rewards which, if granted, would raise him to a dizzy height, to a point of rank, power, and riches next to that of the throne itself. As in 1486, so in 1492, in the month of January, to which we are now come, Columbus was dismissed a second time from the Spanish court, and departed sorrowing. The royal flag streamed from the towers of the Alhambra, for Granada had fallen; but in this event our Genoese took little interest. His course led him toward Cordova, for here was Beatrix Enriquez with Ferdinand, now in his fourth year, and here must now be brought Diego, 10 or 12 years old, from La Rabida. Again, it must have been France, his last hope among the nations with which the thoughts of Columbus were busy. Be that as it may, when but 2 leagues from Granada, who should overtake him but a royal constable sent post haste by the queen with orders for his return? His demands, one and all, would be complied with. What specifically it was that induced the Spanish sovereigns to change their minds may be only inferred. Whether it was proof of actual islands to the west, proof secretly confided to Columbus at Palos, no one knows. Whatever it was, the lost cause was powerfully pleaded before Isabella by Luis de Santangel, treasurer of Aragon, and before Ferdinand by Juan Cabrera, his chamberlain, and by Juan Diego of Deza, preceptor to Prince John. The risk was small, the possibilities for God and the realm were incalculable. Such, we are told, was the reasoning. Especially was it the reasoning of Santangel, and so wrought upon by it was Isabella, that, seized with enthusiasm, she is said to have tendered her jewels, priceless gems that they were, in security for money for the enterprise. What manner of navigator was this Genoese, this Christopher Columbus, by whom this vast enterprise had been conceived, and by whom it was to be carried out? He was indeed no stranger to the sea, for he had been to Chios in the east, to Africa in the south, and to England in the north. To use his own words, "I have traversed the sea for 23 years, without leaving it for any time worth counting, and I saw all the Levant, and the west, Azores, etc., and the north, which is the way to England, and I have been to Guinea." In nautical skill, the scientific feature of seafaring, Columbus, according to the most competent opinion, was, however, little advanced. He claimed that on his Guinea trips he had verified Alfraganus's calculation of the length of a degree on the equator at 56 2/3 Italian miles; but aside from the fact that at the period of these trips, 1482 to 84, he could hardly have known of Alfraganus or his calculation, for he then presumably knew nothing of the Imago Mundi of Pierre d'Ailly, a book possibly not then even published. There remains the further fact that verification was a process quite too complex for any means at his disposal. His claim, therefore, tends only to prove him guilty of what a stanch admirer does not hesitate to characterize as insufferable braggadocio. But daunted as little by the obstacle of ignorance as by other obstacles, the would-be discoverer held unflinchingly to his role, and when all was over and the triumph won, could bring himself to say, "I had from our Lord a spirit of intelligence. In regard to navigation he made me very intelligent; of astrology he gave me what was sufficient, and also of geometry and arithmetic. He gave me an ingenious mind, and hands apt in designing this sphere, and upon it the cities, mountains, and the rivers, the islands and harbours, all in their proper place. In this time I saw and studied diligently all the books of cosmography, history, and of philosophy, and of other sciences. Yet for all this confidence, if the voyage of 1492 had depended on the technical knowledge of Columbus, its history would be brief. Indeed, had it not been for Martin Alonso Pinzon, it would never have been made in that year. Pinzon, we may recall, was in 1492 the chief citizen of Palos. After the Spanish sovereigns had decided to sanction and subvention the Colombian undertaking, they gave decree that of the 3 caravels required, 2 should be furnished by the town of Palos in discharge of a feudal liability to the crown, and Columbus on the 12th of May set out from Granada to make sure of the vessels. The pending expedition was unpopular in itself, and still more unpopular in that its admiral was a foreigner. But at length Columbus obtained the 3 caravels, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria Capitana. So far well, or fairly well, and then a balk. The seamen of Palos unanimously and persistently refused to embark. To them the project was perilous, chimerical, and vain, a subject of derision. Columbus had papers for the impressment of criminals, but to escape this necessity he went to Pinzon, who supplied the sailors on being assured of some share in the enterprise. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Chapter 2, Part 2 of the Spanish Conquerors by Irving Berdine Richman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Columbus and New Lands. In respect to size, rig, and equipment, the 3 Colombian caravels were nearly the same. The Santa Maria, which was slightly the largest, measured about 80 feet in length, 25 feet in breadth, and 15 feet in depth, and had a capacity of over 200 tons. All were fully decked, had 3 masts, and, except upon the mizzen, were square rigged. The Santa Maria and Pinta had each a high poop deck and forecastle, but the Nina, reputed the smallest of the 3, had neither. All were good sailors, making as a flotilla an average speed of 15 Italian miles an hour, and each had something of an armament. The personnel of the expedition comprised some 90 seamen and 30 royal officials, servants, domestics, and cabin boys, but no friar or ecclesiastic was listed. In supreme command of the expedition was Columbus himself on the Santa Maria, and in command of the Santa Maria was her owner, the cosmographer Juan de la Cosa. This vessel carried also 2 pilots, a grand constable, a physician, an archivist, and an interpreter versed in several tongues. The Pinta was commanded by Martin Alonso Pinzon, and one of its 2 pilots was Martin's brother Francisco, while as commander of the Nina sailed Vicente Yanez Pinzon, youngest brother of Martin Alonso, and one of the 2 future discoverers of subequatorial South America. The pilot was the owner, Pero Alonso Nino. Columbus set sail from Palos on August 3, 1492, at sunrise. First, however, he had arranged for sending his young son Diego to Cordova to be cared for by Beatrix Enriquez, with whom was his younger son Ferdinand. First also, supremely first, he had made confession and solemnly received the sacrament. As his ships cleared the bar of Saltees and gathered headway, naught but inspiring could have been the spectacle. The high prows, the huge square sails, each emblazoned with its cross, the magnificent sweep of the rakish latines athwart the towering sterns, the flags and streamers, the officers crowding the poop decks, the sailors thronging the forecastles and crow's nests, all saluting, many praying, some no doubt weeping, all crying adios. How tremendous it all was, how much it meant! As a mere feat of seamanship, however, this first recorded voyage across the Atlantic was not considerable. The flotilla left the Canary island of Gomera on September 6, 1492, and shaped a course westward. The winds blew steadily astern, no storms arose, the resources of navigation were in no wise taxed. Indeed, on the 16th of September, and often afterwards, Columbus notes that they met with very temperate breezes, so that there was great pleasure in enjoying the mornings, nothing being wanted but the song of nightingales. The weather, he says, was like April in Andalusia. Apprehension, nevertheless, did not sleep; it lurked. Already solemn Teneriffe had raised above them in greeting, mayhap in warning, its staff of fire. The Needle, victim perchance of subtle necromancy, had begun straying from the pole. Grass, first in green tufts, then in fine masses, then in tangles and skeins, with crabs enmeshed, that grass before which a prince of Portugal had once turned back, was all about them. Yea, slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea. And those winds, so balmy, but so fatefully setting into the unknown west, was it not all a snare of unseen powers? There were murmurs, plots, it is said, to seize the admiral unawares and hurl him overboard. Columbus, on his part, laughed at the fears of the sailors and made them big offers of wealth. Had he not the whole of Cathay before him? That in his mind Columbus had Asia, the country of the Great Khan, as in some sort of a destination, cannot well be gainsaid if we are prepared to yield any substantial credence to his journal as we have it. According to that document, he was expecting, as early as the 16th of September, to come upon islands, but made the mainland to be more distant, and thought it better to go at once to the continent and afterwards to the islands. But of the events of this voyage, his though it was, Columbus was not sole arbiter. Martin Alonso Pinzon, by circumstances, and also perhaps by agreement, was an associate, and in his mind evidently the destination was Cimpangou, or Japan. As will be recalled, he had brought from Rome a chart and a book, both of which he had handed to Columbus. Now in the book was this sentence: "In navigating by the Mediterranean Sea to the end of Spain, and thence in the direction where the sun sinks between the north and the south, you will find a land of Simpanso (Cimpangou), which is so fertile and so rich that by aid of its resources you will be able to subjugate both Africa and Europe." Furthermore, inspired by the book and also by Marco Polo, Pinzon, in a recruiting appeal to the seamen of Pallas, had said: "Friends, come with us on this voyage. Here you are in poverty, come with us, for according to accounts you will find the houses with roofs of gold, and you will return rich and prosperous." When, therefore, on the 25th of September, Martin Alonso called Columbus's attention to the fact that, according to a chart which both were using, the flotilla ought to be sighting certain islands, we were not surprised, for it was islands, or at least the island of Japan, and not a mainland, in which the interests of Pinzon centered. And when, on the 7th of October, Columbus, in deference to the wish of Pinzon, actually changed direction from west to west southwest, and when on the 12th land Guanahani, or Watling Island, rewarded the change, it was natural that both Columbus and Pinzon should be convinced that they were in an archipelago of Asiatic India, with Japan not far away. The expedition now had traversed 1,123 leagues, or 4,492 Italian miles, from the Canaries, and yet, as Ferdinand Columbus informs us, 700 or 750 leagues, 3,000 miles, was the distance at which the admiral had told his men that he expected to find land. If this land was the Antillia Salvaggio Reala group, West Indies or Antilles, as seems probable, it is represented on the Himes globe through a composite Antilia, as from 2,200 to 2,500 miles west from the Canaries, and it was at about this distance, on and near the 25th of September, that both Columbus and Pinzon began anxiously scanning the horizon. The fact that 3,000 miles was given out by Columbus as the distance to be covered before land might be looked for may be explained by his wish to mislead his crews into the belief that they were committed to a longer, unbroken voyage than they really were. He in fact states repeatedly in his journal that he kept a dual reckoning, one of actual distances for himself and one of minimized distances for his men. How he could have contrived to do this, with half a dozen pilots and a score or more of others at his elbow, more competent at rating a ship's progress than himself, goodness, as Lord Dunraven puts it, only knows. A landfall in the case of any 15th century voyage of discovery was momentous, but especially was it so in the case of a Spanish voyage. Commanders fell on their knees and gave thanks. Crews chanted the Gloria in excelsis Deo and crowded into the rigging and tops. Flags were run up and guns were fired. So was it at Guanahani on October 12, 1492. Clad in armor over which, true to his taste in color and to his instinct for effect, he had thrown the crimson robe of an admiral of Castile, Columbus, with the furled royal standard grasped in his left hand, bent low to the earth which he saluted. His actions were imitated by the captains of the Pinta and Nina, Martin Alonzo Pinzon and his brother Vincente Yacht, who bore standards emblazoned each with a green cross. Then rising, Columbus summoned to him the royal notary and the royal inspector as witnesses, unfurled the royal standard, drew his sword, and proclaimed the island the possession henceforth of the crown of Spain, naming it San Salvador. So the day ended, but early the next morning, as we are told, the natives gathered on the shore in large numbers, and, destitute of beards themselves, looked with wonder on the bearded Spaniards, on Columbus in particular. To his beard and those of his men they reached out their fingers and viewed attentively the whiteness of the Spanish hands and faces. On the 28th of October the expedition discovered Cuba, and on the 5th of December Hayti, or Hispaniola. Everywhere Columbus was charmed with the scenery. The herbage is like that of April in Andalusia. Andalusia serves always as the standard of comparison. So pleasant are the songs of birds that it seems as though a man could never wish to leave the place. Parrots rise in flocks so dense as to conceal the sun. In Cuba are palm trees, differing from those in Spain and Guinea. As for the inhabitants of the new regions, they are docile, very gentle and kind, going naked, without arms, and without law. But the things which make a particular appeal to the discoverer are five: gold, religion, spices, Simpangu, and Cathay. Gold he began inquiring about from the natives on the day following the landing. "I was attentive and took trouble to ascertain," he says, "if there was gold. But gold in the journal is a theme hardly more emphasized than religion." On the very day of the landing, Columbus writes, "I believe that they (the natives) would easily be made Christians, as it appeared to me they had no sect." He was equally attentive to any mention of spices. "According as I obtain tidings of gold or spices, I shall settle what must be done." Moreover, it is in connection with spices that the journal introduces Simpangu and Cathay. Having, on the 7th of October, given over the search for the mainland, Columbus, on the 21st, speaks of proceeding to Simpangu, which he identifies with Cuba because of the latter's size and riches. It is better, he says, to inspect much land until some very profitable country is reached, my belief being that it will be rich in spices. And on the 24th he resumes: "On the spheres that I saw before leaving Spain, and on the paintings of world maps, Cipangu is in this region." Then on the 26th of October the subject is dropped, with the remark: "I departed for Cuba, for by the signs the Indians made of its greatness and of its gold and pearls, I thought that it must be the one, that is to say, Cipangu." But the mainland recurs in his thoughts, and on the 30th he decides, from a statement by the Indians, that Cuba itself is the mainland of Asia, with Cathay and the Great Khan somewhere therein, and that he must send to the latter the credentials he bears from Ferdinand and Isabella. Accordingly, on the 2nd of November, he dispatches from a point on the Cuban coast his official interpreter, Luis de Torres, a converted Jew, with a party carrying specimens of spices, to ask for the king of that land. To him they are to deliver the credentials, and from him they are to inquire concerning certain provinces, ports, and rivers, of which the admiral has notice. Later, Columbus identifies Cipangu with Hayti, but Cuba he consistently continued to regard as the mainland, peering expectantly into its bays and up its streams for populous cities, such as the Quinsay of Marco Polo and of the world maps like Fra Mauro's of 1457 59, which he saw before leaving Spain. Having completed his voyage by finding what he sought, though manifestly not populous cities, Columbus set sail from the eastern end of the island of Hayti for home on January 16, 1493. Two occurrences hastened his return. On November 21, 1492, Martin Alonso Pinzon, impatient for the discovery of Cipangu and the realization of those dreams of gold, on the strength of which he had secured enlistments at Palos, had gone off in the Pinta for some prospecting of his own. Then on Christmas night the Santa Maria had been wrecked, leaving the admiral with only the Nina wherein to continue his explorations. Thus handicapped, he had been forced to build on Hispaniola, Hayti, a fortress, La Navidad, where he left 37 of his men and crowded into the Nina the remainder. Pinzon had rejoined the expedition on January 6, 1493, but the admiral was much vexed and not disposed to parley or linger, nor is his vexation hard to understand. Columbus was the titular and technical head of the expedition, but in reality he was much the servant of his lieutenant, for Pinzon was a Spaniard, the friend and fellow townsman of the crews, who would not have endured to see him disciplined. In strong contrast to the voyage out, the voyage back was tempestuous. Storms began on the 12th of February, and so grew in violence that on the 14th Columbus placed in a barrel a parchment inscribed with an account of his discoveries and committed it to the sea. But he succeeded in making port in the Portuguese island of Santa Maria, one of the Azores, whence he sailed for Castile. More storms delayed him, but on the 4th of March the Nina entered the Tagus and anchored off Rastello. Of the fate of the Pinta, meanwhile, nothing had been known since the 14th of February, when she had disappeared running before the wind. Once at anchor, and once having satisfied the Portuguese authorities that he was a duly accredited officer of the Spanish marine, Columbus was hospitably received, granted supplies, and invited by King John II, the same with whom he had held memorable converse in 1483 or 1484, to visit him at Valparaiso, near Lisbon. Columbus went with some trepidation, and, according to Portuguese accounts, told the king that he had come from the discovery of the islands of Cipangu and Antilia, but made no mention of Cathay and the Great Khan or of India. O man of miserable understanding, the king is said by Spaniards to have exclaimed at the interview, smiting his breast, "Why didst thou let an undertaking of such great importance go out of thine hands?" By the 15th of March the admiral was at Palos, where on the evening of the same day Martin Alonso Pinzon likewise arrived, having brought the Pinta safe into port at Bayona in Galicia. But it was a full month before Columbus was received by Ferdinand and Isabella in Barcelona, and in the meantime Pinzon, already ill when he disembarked, had breathed his last. What light upon the great voyage to the Antilles might have been shed had Pinzon, forceful personality that he was, survived! In Seville, where, amid much ovation, Columbus awaited the pleasure of the Spanish sovereigns, there came to him a letter dated the 30th of March, addressed to the admiral of the Ocean Sea and viceroy and governor of the islands discovered in the Indies, and confirming what had previously been conditionally granted to him in the capitulation and letters patent of April, 1492. If the welcome to the admiral at Seville had been noteworthy, that which he was accorded at Barcelona was more noteworthy still. Throngs attended him, and his body guard was the best chivalry of Spain. In advance marched a group of some half dozen New World Indians and a squad of sailors from the Nina. The Indians wore gold armaments and carried spears and arrows, while the sailors bore aloft 40 parrots of gorgeous plumage, besides other birds, together with rare plants and animals, among which not the least was an iguana 5 feet long, its back bristling with spines. Ferdinand and Isabella, happy at the success of their adventurous protégé, which no doubt they had scarcely expected, were augustly gracious. Seated under a golden canopy in the Alcazar of the Moorish kings, they rose to greet Columbus on his entry, gently deprecated his lowliness in stooping to kiss their hands, and made him sit at their feet. So placed, the discoverer of America, a master of speech, told his tale, illustrating it with the Indians, the sailors, the specimens, and the gold. The monarchs and court then said a prayer, the choir of the royal chapel chanted Te Deum, and the ceremony closed. The news of the return of Columbus soon spread and evoked ingenious appraisals among the learned. In the month of August last, as Hannibal Guarnerius, an Italian gentleman from Barcelona, wrote to his brother in 1493, this great king, Ferdinand, at the prayer of one named Columba, caused 4 little vessels to be equipped to navigate upon the ocean in a straight line toward the west, until finally the east was reached. The earth being round, he should certainly arrive in the eastern regions. Also from Barcelona, on the 14th of May, Peter Martyr, the Horace Walpole of his day, wrote to his friend Count Delia, a few days after an attempted assassination of King Ferdinand, there returned from the western Antipodes a certain Christopher Columbus, a Ligurian, who, with barely 3 ships, penetrated to the province which was believed to be fabulous. He returned bearing substantial proofs in the shape of many precious things, and particularly of gold. Again, on the 1st of October, this time from Milan, Martyr wrote to the Archbishop of Braga, "A certain Columbus has sailed to the western Antipodes, even as he believes to the very shores of India. He has discovered many islands beyond the Eastern Ocean adjoining the Indies, which are believed to be those of which mention has been made among cosmographers. I do not wholly deny this, although the magnitude of the globe seems to suggest otherwise, for there are not wanting those who think it but a small journey from the end of Spain to the shores of India." Finally, on January 31, 1494, our letter writer addresses these words to the Archbishop of Granada: "The King and Queen at Barcelona have created an admiral of the Ocean Sea, Columbus, returned from his most honorable charge, and they have admitted him to sit in their presence, which is, as you know, a supreme proof of benevolence and honor with our sovereigns. But anticipating rumors, reports, and letters, Columbus himself had had a word to say respecting his voyage. Writing from shipboard on February 15, 1493, to Luis de Santangel, his stanch advocate was Isabella, he had declared: "When I reached Juana, Cuba, I followed its coast westwardly and found it so large that I thought it might be the mainland province of Cathay." As a matter of fact, however, interest in this exploit on the part of Columbus attached itself less to the geographical discoveries than to the preternatural creatures that lurked on the margins of the earth. Hannibal Januarius, our Italian acquaintance of epistolary bent, remarked to his brother, apropos of the Genoese navigator, that the earth being round, the latter should certainly arrive in the eastern regions; but forgetful, near the end of his letter, of the scientific aspects of the great voyage, Januarius wrote: "He (Columbus) adds that he has lately been in a country where men are born with tails." Nor was the soft impeachment wholly inaccurate, for in his own shipboard letter to Santangel the admiral said: "There remains for me on the western side of Cuba 2 provinces whereto I did not go, one of which they call Anan, where the people are born with tails." And in his journal Columbus had already noted that far away there were, as he understood, men with one eye and others with dogs' noses, who were cannibals. But he was wary in statement, for in the Santangel letter he concluded the subject by remarking that down to the present he had not found in those islands, the Antilles, any monstrous men as many expected. With regard to mermaids it was different. These the admiral had himself seen, both on the coast of Guinea and in the Antilles. The Antillean sirens, as he had seen them, were 3 in number. They rose well out of the sea, but were not so beautiful as painted, though having to some extent the human face. And Columbus believed in Amazons. He had never beheld any, but had been told they lived in the island of Martinino (Martinique), and he had meant to stop there on his way home to secure a few to exhibit, along with his Indians, to Ferdinand and Isabella. His half-dozen Indians, his 40 gorgeous parrots, his spined iguana, and his gold, of the latter not more than enough to whet a royal appetite, together with stories about mermaids and natives who burnt a queer herb, tobaccos, were about all in the way of wonders, ocular or auricular, that Columbus had brought home with him. The great thing, the super epoch-making thing, though not yet understood so to be, was the voyage itself, and the will to make it. This, too, largely irrespective of whether the objective was in some sort Asia, or simply a Barataria, an island to govern. Besides the voyage of 1492, Columbus made 3 other voyages. On the second, which lasted from September 1493 to March 1496, and was undertaken with 17 ships and 1,500 men, including his brother Diego, he discovered Porto Rico and Jamaica, learned that his colony of 1492 at La Navidad had been totally destroyed, and founded in its stead in Hispaniola, Haiti, the ambitious settlement of Isabella. He also visited Cuba and compelled his entire ship's company to make oath that they believed it to be the mainland, the alpha or beginning of the Indies. The third voyage of Columbus, from January 1498 to October 1500, was undertaken with 6 ships and 200 men to test the opinion of King John II of Portugal that to the south there lay a continent. And the opinion was sustained, for the voyage was signalized by the admiral's greatest achievement, next to that of 1492, the discovery of the mainland of America at Paria, near the mouths of the Orinoco. Mistaking the land at first for an insular body, he soon came to realize its true character. As early as July 1498 he wrote: "It is certain that the discovery of this land in this place is as great a miracle as the discovery on the first voyage." And in August he thus confided to his journal: "I am convinced that this is the mainland, and very large, of which no knowledge has been had until now." Later, in October, when writing to Ferdinand and Isabella, he said, "I think that if the river mentioned, the Orinoco, does not proceed from the terrestrial paradise, it comes from an immense tract of land in the south, of which no knowledge has been hitherto obtained." But meanwhile in Hispaniola conditions, social and political and economical, had become chaotic, and in 1500 the admiral was superseded as governor by Francisco de Bobadilla, who, stretching his authority, arrested his predecessor, together with his brother Bartholomew and his brother Diego, and sent them to Spain in fetters. Promptly released by the sovereigns, Columbus, after an affecting, and on his part, we may be sure, eloquent scene with Isabella, was released with the promise of a restoration of his privileges, as defined in the capitulation and letters patent, and was placed, so to speak, on waiting orders. By 1501 the admiral had conceived the project of a fourth voyage, to be made with 4 caravels and 150 men, but before setting out in 1502 he deposited his papers in safe keeping, drafted his will, and wrote to the Bank of St. George in Genoa, offering a tenth of his yearly income for the reduction of food taxes in that commonwealth. This last maritime enterprise was shared by his brother Bartholomew and his son Ferdinand, now a lad of 14, and had for its main motive the disclosure of some avenue by which Asia, that part of it where lay the riches, might be attained. In short, Columbus had now come to realize that thus far he had failed to reach the country of the Great Khan. He felt that he must have reached Asia, but at a point lying to the south of Cathay and India, and as for flanking the difficulty by penetrating to the south yet further, an immense tract of land, a mainland, interposed. Still, in the interposing mass there must be a narrow place, and through this a strait, for the currents that set westward from Jamaica so indicated. It is to be observed that on this voyage he pretty much ceased to concern himself with Cipangu, so manifestly futile were all attempts to identify it with Hispaniola. For a full year Columbus skirted the coast of Central America from Carriari in Nicaragua to the site of Puerto Bello in Panama, hearing of pepper and of people in rich clothing, of commerce, and of the river Ganges. In November 1504 he returned to Spain, where Isabella, his patroness, was at this time on her deathbed, so that his many letters to the Spanish court remained unacknowledged. With some premonition of his own demise, Columbus now busied himself with his last will, charging his son Diego to provide for the maintenance of Beatrix, a person to whom I am under great obligations, and "let this," he continues, "be done for the discharge of my conscience, for it weighs heavy on my soul." On May 20, 1506, at Valladolid, broken, discouraged, well nigh forgotten even in Spain, the discoverer of America, viceroy of the Indies, and admiral of the ocean, breathed his last. The discoverer of America strikingly illustrates the aphorism that the world's great men, so far from having commonly been men of learning, have often been but glorified enthusiasts. To Columbus the South, the upper coast of South America at the mouths of the Orinoco, meant the terrestrial paradise of Sir John Mandeville, a spot where the earth's surface, ceasing to be rounded, was pinched into a stem, on the summit of which the paradise rested, and down the sides of which rolled such mighty streams as the Orinoco. It meant also the golden Cheronese of Ptolemy, Malay Peninsula, where in 1 year Solomon gathered 656 quintals of gold and all manner of precious stones. It was because of this south, so gravely misconceived by him geographically, that Columbus, anticipating the project of Magellan, entertained at the end of his second voyage the idea of returning to Europe by way of the Indian Ocean. If he had had an abundance of provisions, says his son Ferdinand, he would not have returned to Spain except by way of the East. To say of Columbus that he was not conspicuous for learning is but to repeat that his chief powers were moral, not intellectual. Patience, endurance, tenacity, energy, and will, these, despite his ignorance, made him great. Cupidity and vanity, entailing boastfulness and craft, we have noted as his chief weaknesses; but as to cupidity the record is perhaps less vulnerable than it is at times represented. Throughout the years 1500 to 1504, the years preceding and including his fourth voyage, gold was to Columbus indeed a thing infinitely precious, precious in itself, but far more so as the indispensable justification of his life and work. Then it is that we find him writing, "Gold is most excellent, gold is treasure, and he who possesses it does all he wishes to in this world, and succeeds in helping souls into paradise." Columbus was religious, formally and ceremoniously, albeit sincerely religious. From an early date, in fact, while at Granada before his first voyage, he had embraced the idea of rescuing the Holy Sepulchre from the infidel. To this end he was resolved, or so deemed himself, to devote his profits from the Indies. And withal he was eloquent. He waxed eloquent over the Holy Sepulchre, and when after his third voyage he was put upon waiting orders, alike to the impairment of his revenues and the wounding of his pride, he waxed eloquent over that injustice. "I have arrived at and am in such a condition," he writes in 1500, "that there is no person so vile but thinks that he may insult me. He shall be reckoned in the world as valour itself who is courageous enough to consent to it. If I were to steal the Indies, or the land which lies toward them, of which I am now speaking, from the altar of St. Peter, and give them to the Moors, they could not show greater enmity toward me in Spain." Who would believe such a thing where there was always so much magnanimity? "I undertook a fresh voyage to the new heaven and earth, which up to that time had remained hidden; and if it is not held there in esteem, like the other voyages to the Indies, that is no wonder, because it came to be looked upon as my work." His yet more famous letter, written in 1503 from Jamaica on his fourth voyage, is the cry of a Wolsey left naked to his enemies: "I was 28 years old when I came into your Highness's service, and now I have not a hair upon me that is not grey. My body is infirm, and all that was left to me, as well as to my brothers, has been taken away and sold, even to the frock that I wore, to my great dishonour. I implore your Highnesses to forgive my complaints. I am indeed in as ruined a condition as I have related. Hitherto I have wept over others. May heaven now have mercy upon me, and may the earth weep over me. Weep for me, whoever has charity, truth, and justice." In the spirit of that charity, truth, and justice which Columbus here invokes, let it be said that whatever his deflections from straightforwardness, he was not alone therein in his age or profession. Martin Behaim, Sebastian Cabot, and Amerigo Vespucci, not one of them as a navigator dealt honestly with his own age or with posterity. But points of character aside, what in the case of the great Genoese most excites wonder is not that he discovered America, but that America should have remained to be discovered by him. The expedition of Thales, or that of Dulmo and Estreito Behaim, might well have reached the western continent as early as 1500. Indeed, Vicente Yañez Pinzon for Spain, and Pedralibárez Cabral for Portugal, touched the coasts of South America. Furthermore, as the region which was discovered by Columbus perpetuates in the name Antilles, the mythical island of Antilia, so the region discovered by Pinzon and Cabral perpetuates in the name Brazil, the mythical island of Brazil. End of Chapter 2.